you are no less academic than any of us. So I'll just can you see my screen?
Not yet, sir. Now it's visible.
Okay. Okay. So thank you everybody for joining in. We are going to discuss something very important today. That is the interpretation of tests of significance. And before I go into it though, I thought it would be important to ask you all a question. Okay. Now today is a Saturday. There are many interesting things going on. You can be on Netflix, or you can spend time with your family. Then why would you waste time on statistics? Some of you I'm sure are here because you are interested. Some of you are here because it's being organized, but you really need a reason to spend your 1 hour over here discussing what we are discussing today. And I'm going to tell you this from experience. It is not what is written in any textbook. Is that without a clear understanding of statistics in your field of oncology, you will not be able to interpret medical research. And you will be misled every single day by anecdotes of your colleagues, by the media, and by the industry. And without your understanding of statistics, you will not be able to summarize your experiences or conduct any research in a way that is meaningful for your patients or for the medical community. Now, these are very, heavy sentences, but it is true. If you actually love your patients, and many of you are basically clinicians, aren't you? So even if you have no interest in research or doing any studies or randomized control trials, if you like your patients and you would like to do the best for them, you need to understand medical statistics. And so if you are spending these Saturdays, led by, Jibok and Kostov and Rajatda and Jyotirup and Shumon and Shantanuda, it is because they also understand the importance of what we are doing here today. So it is time very well spent. So I would like to congratulate the Arroy West Bengal for actually thinking of it. And I can see the amount of effort that some of the people are putting in. Jibok and Kostov. Thank you very much. This is very important and you've done a great job. So let's carry on. So what are we going to cover today? We are going to cover something that we will use all the time. That is the p-value. Okay, so most of the time today will be spent discussing what is a p-value and how should we look at it. The second thing we are going to cover is how not to misinterpret the p-value. The third thing we are going to look at is what are confidence intervals. This is another term that many of you will see all the time, and how to interpret confidence intervals in the context of evaluating new treatments or evaluating summaries of descriptive summaries and things like that, and how it is related to the p-value that you will see. We will discuss the difference between clinical and statistical significance, and we will touch on something called hazard ratios. Hazard ratios will be taught in other classes also, but we are going to see how that is also linked to interpreting tests of significance. Okay, so in today's class, you're not going to learn any SPSS. SPSS, I know that you're being, SPSS is being used to teach you the skills of doing statistical analysis of your own. But a great amount of your time, much more time that you will ever spend doing, statistical analysis, you will spend 3-4 times that amount of time reading, papers and doing journal clubs and things like that. And if you don't understand what people have written, you will not be able to do your own research either. So today is about concepts. So, today we are going to try to be interactive. I know that there are about 19-20 people out there in the learning statistics today. So I don't know many or most of you. So I would like you to interact, because without your interaction, without understanding what you are confused about, we will not be able to proceed very, very far. Okay, so I'm going to ask. So the Google Meet has some cool tools. So we are going to try to use one of them today. So I'm going to ask Jibok to put up the first poll. So we are going to use some polls today. Okay, so basically you have to vote. This is the first question. So let me read out the question and then Jibok can put out the poll. Okay, so this is a very common scenario. You have conducted a clinical trial comparing radiotherapy alone versus radiotherapy and concurrent chemotherapy in the adjuvant setting in endometrial cancer, okay, after surgery. Now, in the RT alone group, the 5-year overall survival was 65%. In the chemoradiation group, it was 69%. And the p-value was 0.04. Now you got 6 choices. I want you to take some time, read them, and say which one you think is the one that you will choose as the best interpretation of the p-value.
Shall I launch the poll, sir?
Yeah, please do.
Jibok,
Yes.
please explain everyone where to go and how to just submit their answer in the poll. Explain,
Yeah, you
please.
can see in the right, there is an option for polls. You just have to click that. Your name will not be shown. Just the records will be shown. The percentage of polling results will be shown. I hope it is visible. Yeah, we are getting votes. So that means it's working.
Unfortunately, I don't. On the polls. Yeah,
Yes, sir.
Where is the option? I'm unable to see.
On the right side where you can see people who are there, there is an option for Q&A and poll.
So there is an option of chat box. After the chat box, there is there is a triangular shaped thing. Above triangle, there is a rectangle and there is a circle. And click that icon, and you will see polls and question answer. And in polls, you have to find out the this options. Sir, can you everyone get it? I guess.
Actually, I'm using my cell phone. I'm not sure whether it is visible there.
Sir, can you see it? Sir, Indranil sir?
I found it. Yeah.
Okay.
I found it. Although I cannot see I think that I don't know how I think you have the rights to present the results. So I cannot see the results because I'm logged in much like all the rest of the people. Yeah.
Okay, but the results will be shown to everyone. I think once I end the poll, it will be shown to everyone.
Okay. Okay. Great.
So how much time should we wait? We are not getting much votes, but it's there.
I think poll option is not available on smartphone.
Yeah, somebody else is also chatting that has put a comment in the chat. So I would like whoever is able to use the poll. This is so those who are not able to use the poll. Okay, why don't you just put in the answer in the chat box? Whoever writing which option A to F, you choose one option and you put it in the chat box. These are all experiments we are running, so don't worry about it. In any case, all of this is anonymous. The poll is anonymous, so don't hesitate to put in your best choice. It doesn't matter if you're wrong. Okay, so with the first question, let us give people a few more seconds, maybe another 10-15 seconds.
Okay.
And then we will continue.
So I'm ending the poll now.
Yeah, okay.
So I think the result is visible to you, sir, now.
Yeah, we are able to see the results. So we got 5 votes over here, and some people have written in the chat box, and the consent. Most people seem to think that it is answer 6 or F. Okay, and some people, have voted for the next most common is answer E. Okay, so that's great. So we've got some responses. Thank you. So I'll just go back to my slides. Okay, can all of you see my slide? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So before we answer this question, let us take a step back and answer and go through some very important concepts that are relevant in the context of answering this question. Okay, so can you see the slide which says what is a hypothesis? I'm just verifying whether you can see my slides change.
Yes, sir, it's in.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So what is a hypothesis? Okay, now when we are discussing statistics, when we are trying out a new therapy or we are doing a study, we generally start with a hypothesis. Okay, sometimes we do descriptive studies. We just want to know that we've got 150 cases of breast cancer. We just want to describe their age and stage and something like that. But when we do an intervention or when we try something new or we compare two different things, then we usually do it for a reason, right? We have some idea or we have a hunch that something is better than something else, something is worse, or something is more costly, or something like that. Now, that is a hypothesis. And I've given in this slide 3 examples. The first example is that I'm trying a new drug A, and I think that drug A will improve the survival over drug B. Okay, that is a hypothesis. Another hypothesis could be that IMRT will cause less xerostomia than 3D conformal radiotherapy in head and neck cancer. And the third hypothesis could be that, administration of a new drug C will result in some objective responses in biliary tract cancer. Each of these are hypotheses. In the first example, I'm comparing a new drug A with an older drug B. In the second example, I'm using a new technique of radiotherapy. In the third example, I'm not comparing against anything. I just think that giving this drug may be useful, so there will be some objective responses, and I want to check by doing a study. So all of these are hypotheses. Okay. Now, within the context of a hypothesis, you have two terms, which is known as null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. And this is where you need to get your concepts very clear. The null hypothesis assumes that there is no effect of what you're testing in the population, which means that if you're testing radiotherapy versus chemoradiation, there is no difference in survival between radiotherapy and chemoradiation. But what your actual hypothesis is the alternative hypothesis, is that you feel that probably concomitant chemoradiation improves survival compared to radiotherapy alone in locally advanced head and neck cancer. This is usually what we are trying to investigate. But in investigating that, the first step we have to take is to state that this is my hypothesis, and correspondingly, a null hypothesis is assumed. And it is assumed that actually there is no difference. Concomitant chemoradiation causes no improvement in locally advanced head and neck cancer. Okay. Now, why is this important? It is important to understand how you interpret the results of a study. Now, why do we need these hypotheses and these statistical tests in the first place? Okay, suppose you want to compare radiation versus chemoradiation, which is very common. You know, if you are MD students, then many of your theses, MD thesis, will be comparing radiation versus chemoradiation. So you might feel that why go into all this trouble? I will treat some patients with radiation. I will treat some patients with chemoradiation. I will see how many patients survived in radiation, how many patients didn't survived in chemoradiation. And I will just see if one group is 60%, the other group is 65%, 65% is better. What is all this complication about? About p-values, hypothesis, this, that, confidence intervals. Why do you think we need all of these things? The reason we need all of these things is that we are never, practically never, able to test the entire population. And here I'm using the term population as the entire group of patients with locally advanced head and neck cancer, for example. Okay, now you don't have access to all the hundreds of thousands of people with locally advanced head and neck cancer. So if you had access to all of them and you tested, treatment A versus treatment B, you would have the answer. It would be straightforward. But you don't have access to everybody. So basically what you're going to do is that you are going to take a sample from the population. Now, when you're taking a sample, you have no idea whether your sample is truly representative of the population or not. Okay? You're going to try hard to make it representative of the population, but it is not always possible. But you will have to do your test on a sample. You can't do your test on hundreds of thousands of people. So because we are taking a sample and not the entire population, there will be some errors. By errors, I mean that I will never know the true value of what I am doing. I will just get a value from a sample which may be slightly different from what I would have gotten if I actually had a chance to test the entire population. Okay, so from the sample, I can say, for example, take a sample of breast cancer patients and see what their mean age is. Okay, now I cannot say that the mean age for all breast cancer patients all over the world when they are diagnosed is 42. Okay, but my sample says it's 42. So the 42 that I'm getting is known as the point estimate. Okay, it is one number, it's the point estimate, but I have an error around it. And all of statistics is basically trying to see what kind of error I have, whether that is acceptable or not, and whether two different point estimates are really different or not. So the point estimate of survival from radiotherapy versus the point estimate of survival from chemoradiation, is it sufficiently different to call it different in the total population? Okay, so the two concepts that we learned is, one is that there is a hypothesis. To test the hypothesis, we need to take a sample from the population that we are trying to get the answer for. And once we've got some values from a population, from a sample, then how does this sample really relate to the entire population? For that, we need to understand the concept of probability. Okay? So probability by itself is a very simple concept. How likely is something is an event? How likely is something to happen? Okay? Now, probability is a number which is expressed between 0 and 1. So if the probability is 1, then it will always happen. If the probability is 0, it will never happen. Okay. Now we are going to combine these three concepts of a hypothesis, of a sample from a population, and probability to understand what the p-value is. Now let us get back to, let us just quickly go over what are the steps of testing a hypothesis. My hypothesis was, my hypothesis in the question that we gave you was that chemoradiation is better than radiation alone in the adjuvant treatment of endometrial cancer. Okay. Therefore, my null hypothesis was that there is no difference between chemoradiation and radiation in the adjuvant treatment of endometrial cancer. So I've defined the null and the alternate hypothesis. Now I will take samples from a population. I have some endometrial patients coming to me, or I might get hold of my friends and we might pool all our endometrial patients together, and I could randomize them and divide them into two groups, and I will get a survival value from the control, and I will get a survival value from the test. Control is radiotherapy alone, test is the chemoradiation. Then I will calculate what is known as the test statistic, which you don't need to worry about. And then from the test statistic, compared to a table of probability distributions, we obtain a p-value and we interpret the p-value. Okay, is it different or not different? Okay. Now, what the p-value means really is something that is very important to understand. The p-value is the probability of obtaining these results that we have obtained, or something more extreme, if the null hypothesis is true. Okay? So that may be confusing to you at the moment. So let us go over it in a bit of detail. Okay? Now, what does this mean? So it starts out with the assumption that the null hypothesis is true, that there is no difference. Okay? So if there is no difference between radiotherapy and chemoradiotherapy, I should get no difference in their survival. So both should be 65, or both should be 62, or both should be 60%. But I'm getting a difference, right? How much is the difference? The difference is 65% versus 69%. So I'm getting a difference of 4%. So what is the p-value telling me? That if the null hypothesis was true, then this 4% difference that I'm getting, or something greater than 4%, what is the probability of obtaining that? What is the chance that I will get this 4% difference if the null hypothesis is true? So let us go back to the question. You have conducted this trial, and the 5-year overall survival in the RT alone group was 65%, and in the CT-RT group was 69%. So I'm getting a 4% benefit. What is the probability that I would get this benefit if the null hypothesis is true? Is 0.04. So the probability of getting this kind of difference is only 4% if the null hypothesis is true, because this probability is very low I think now that the null hypothesis is not true. And the alternative hypothesis is valid. So with this value, I can reject the null hypothesis. And all these terms are important, rejecting the null hypothesis. So the correct answer to this question is, the answer number 5 was that if the null hypothesis is true, then the probability that there is an improvement of 4%, that is 65 to 69%, with chemoradiation is 4%. That is probability of 0.04. Okay. So that is what the p-value is telling you. It is not telling you that there is a 0.04% chance. Okay. It is not telling, the second choice is saying that the probability is that there is no difference, that there is no difference between the two arms is 0. No, it is not 0. There is a chance that you may be wrong. It is not 0. It is not a 4% chance that CTRT is worse. It is, none of these other options are true. And the sixth option, which many of you clicked, states it in a different way, which is not the correct way. So it says that if the alternative hypothesis is true, but the p-value does not start out with the assumption that the alternative hypothesis is true. It says that I am assuming that the null hypothesis is true. How likely am I to get this result if the null hypothesis is true? I am very unlikely, only 4% likely, right? So therefore, I am rejecting the null hypothesis. Is that clear? So let's go over it one more time. If the null hypothesis were true, the probability of obtaining these results, that is a 4% benefit from 64 to 65 to 69%, is 0.04 or 4%. As this is a very low probability, below a threshold of 0.05, we reject the null hypothesis, and we usually say that this result is statistically significant. Okay. Now these terms that we are using has a lot of meaning. We often use the term statistically significant. And this is what we use when usually in many studies, the p-value is less than 0.05. Okay, we are going to discuss more about the concept of statistical significance as we go along, but this is where we start. Okay. So if you see that the p-value is less than 0.05, then the null hypothesis, the probability that the null hypothesis will give a result like this is unlikely. Now, how do we use the p-value to derive conclusions? We ask a question. If the null hypothesis is true, could we have obtained this difference in outcome? If the probability of obtaining that difference is low, we reject the null hypothesis. If the probability is not so low, then we cannot reject the null hypothesis. And again, understand these terms, we cannot reject the null hypothesis. Okay? So cannot reject is also important. Now you might ask that why is the cutoff at 0.05? Who decided that? Why not 0.06? Why not 0.10? Why not 0.20? Why is the cutoff at 0.05? Okay, what is so sacrosanct about a 0.05 that we choose that to decide statistical significance? That has something to do with the errors that we decide that we will accept. Okay? I'm not sure whether you have been taught the concept of, type 1 and type 2 errors. Kaustav, Jivok, has there been a class on that?
Sir, there was a class taken by Dr. Anish Banerjee, but if your session wants to give some idea of
We'll discuss that. I just wanted to know whether somebody has discussed this in detail or not. Okay.
that didn't, but you can proceed, sir, no problem.
Okay. So, we, as I said, we are taking samples from a population. We know that the results that we are going to obtain are not going to be exact. Okay, they will not be 100% representative of the population. So we have to accept the fact that there will be some errors. By errors, I mean some difference from the absolute truth. Okay, error is not a mistake that you make. So here error is a difference from the absolute truth. Right. So there are certain types of errors we decide that we are going to accept. Similarly, when we are testing something versus another thing, and we get a result, and we interpret that result, we can sometimes interpret it correctly, but sometimes we can interpret it wrongly also. And there again, we know that we will never be perfect. So we accept a certain error rate over there. Okay. So since this has not been discussed in great detail yet, let us take a few minutes to look at it over here. Okay. So when you have a hypothesis and you're looking for errors in hypothesis testing, you know that these are the results that you have obtained. Okay, so these are the results. And this is the truth. Okay. Now say suppose that there is actually no difference between radiation and chemoradiation. Okay, that is the truth. That is the absolute truth. Now, my experiment may show that that is the case, that there is no difference. Then I'm correct. Okay. But it may show that my difference is significant. Now that is a false positive. It is obviously false, and we are saying positive because it is detecting a difference, and we want to detect differences. So it's a positive, it's a false positive. And there will be some times when we are going to get false positive results. Okay. The converse is also true, that actually there is a difference between radiation and chemoradiation, but my study may not be able to detect it. So there again, I have a false result, but this time it's a false negative result. Okay. Now, before we do any test, okay, comparing two groups, we have to set what kind of error we are okay with. Okay. So we usually, most of the time, we set a type 1 error rate of 5% or 0.05. And we set a type 2 error rate of 20% or 0.2. Okay. Now, why is this 5 and why is this 20? We are generally, as clinicians, as people who interpret studies, conservative. What do I mean by conservative? What I mean is that we don't want to change very easily. Okay. So we are much more strict with a false positive result. We don't want to get false positive results. We don't want to change from radiation to chemoradiation until we are more or less sure that chemoradiation is better. So we accept a much tighter type 1 error rate and a much looser type 2 error rate. We are okay if chemoradiation was better than radiation, but we are getting a negative result. We are much more okay with that than the opposite. We don't want to start treating everybody with chemoradiation unless we are very sure of it. Okay. So we set these two error rates from the beginning, and this term is known as a priori. This is Latin, okay, from before. So we set a type 1 and type 2 error rate whenever we want to make any comparison. Sometimes we do it implicitly. Like for most studies, you don't say that, okay, if my p-value of less than 0.05, then I will consider it significant. But it is implied. Okay, but sometimes when you are setting different type 1 error rates and type 2 error rates, you will have to write that I am going to call something significant only when I am going to get a p-value of less than 0.01. So these rates in many of the important papers are written very clearly that this is my type 1 error, type 2 error. And sometimes it is not written, in which case the type 1 error is always assumed to be 0.05. So this is an error rate that we are happy to accept. If the probability is less than 0.05 in my p-value calculation, then I will say that the probability is very low and the null hypothesis needs to be rejected. If it is more than 0.05, then I will say that no, I cannot reject the null hypothesis. I don't have enough information from this study to say that chemoradiation is better than radiotherapy. Okay, the type 2 error rate is linked to what is known as power calculations, and I am pretty sure somebody is scheduled to teach you about type 1 and type 2 errors and power. Probably Onish will teach you. These are very, very important concepts and you must pay attention in his class. So getting back to the p-value, as a convention, a cutoff of 0.05 or 5% or 0.05 is used. So if the p-value is less than 0.05, I'm going to reject the null hypothesis. If it is more than 0.05, I'm saying I cannot reject the null hypothesis. Sometimes, as I mentioned, we can change this cutoff value because that is in my hands. Okay. I can say that I can make it stricter by using 1% instead of 5%. Okay, or 0.1%. Right? Now, when would I do that? Why would I use a stricter p-value cutoff or alpha error or type 1 error cutoff? I will use this cutoff when I want to be even more sure that something is different from what I usually do at the moment. Okay? Sometimes the implications of rejecting the null hypothesis are very severe. For example, say suppose you're using, FEC chemotherapy in breast cancer. Okay, FEC. Now, you are doing a study now which says that I'm going to test bone marrow transplant versus FEC chemotherapy in breast cancer. Now, obviously, if your bone marrow transplant comes out better, it will have enormous implications on the treatment of breast cancer patients. You don't want to certify bone marrow transplant unless you are very, very, very sure. Okay? So then you will by yourself make this type 1 error cutoff strict. Okay? But there are more common reasons why this is done. One is that when you're doing multiple comparisons, we are going to come to multiple comparisons shortly. But what is very important to understand is that this is decided before the data is collected. It is decided in the design of your study. You cannot change your cutoff after you've done your calculations. You've done your calculations and the p-value is 0.06. You cannot say that now I'm going to set my alpha error rate as 0.07 such that now 0.06 is statistically significant. Okay, so this has to be done, what I said, a priori. from before. Okay, so this is something that is important to understand about the p-value. So that there's a p-value threshold. Usually it is 0.05. 0.05 is the alpha or the type 1 error that is set. It is set by convention. Sometimes it is changed from the convention of 0.05. But if there is something that we are doing differently, we must do it at that study design phase, not after the results are calculated. Okay. So with this, let's come to the second question, which tests a different concept. Okay. Now your thesis compares a new drug. I just called it CX524. Many new drugs are given names like that, as an agent to reduce oral mucositis in head and neck cancer patients undergoing radiotherapy. You have randomized 50 patients. Okay, this is a typical thesis, 50 patients. 27 in the usual standard of care arm A, 23 patients in arm B, which has the new drug. At 6 weeks, 20 of the 27 patients in arm A have grade 3 or 4 mucositis, and 14 out of the 23 patients in arm B have grade 3 or 4 mucositis. You do a chi-square test and you get a p-value of 0.23. Now look at the 5 choices and tell me what is your single best explanation or possibility with this result. So Jivok, you can put the poll on.
Yes, it's there.
And if you can't see the poll, don't worry. You just put your answer in the chat box. I can only see the first question though. Oh, question 2 is there. Yeah, question 2 is live. So I want to see a few answers, either in the poll or in the chat box.
Shall I stop the poll now?
Okay, but have you had any responses?
Yeah, I have around 8 to 9 responses.
Okay, fine.
Okay. So you can see the result now.
Yeah, we can see the results. So there are 3 votes which say that the chi-square test is the wrong test to use. 2 people each feel it's B or C. And there are votes for 1 vote each for no benefit, null hypothesis is rejected. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. So how do we interpret a p-value of more than 0.05? This is something that you're going to do day in and day out. Okay. In 90% of the thesis that you guys will do if you are MD students, you will get a p-value of more than 0.05. So how do you interpret that? P-value of more than 0.05 is interpreted in a specific way. We say that we cannot reject the null hypothesis. Okay? Now, this does not always mean that the two treatments are the same. This is a very, very, very important concept to understand. Okay? This does not mean that the two treatments are the same. It simply means that from the results obtained, we cannot conclude that there is a difference. Our results don't give us enough information to say that they are different. That is not the same as saying that the two treatments are the same. Why could we have obtained these results? We could have obtained these results because of two possible reasons. One is that there is actually no difference. Okay? And the second is that the trial design was such that even though a difference exists, we have a false negative result. Okay? And this is a type 2 error. Remember from the table? Now, often a type 2 error occurs because a study is underpowered. And I think that in a future class, somebody is going to teach you about power calculations. But this is a very important concept. When is a study underpowered? Can somebody unmute any of the students? Unmute and tell me, or write in a chat box, that may be better. When is a study underpowered?
If anyone want to talk, then unmute yourself and you can answer said question, or you can write your answer in the chat box. Please.
Anybody? Any suggestions? You must be knowing.
Sir, someone have been answered here, insufficient sample size.
Yeah.
You have got two answers the same, similar, less sample size, yes.
Yeah. So that is the most common scenario, that you don't have enough patients. The more patients you have, the more likely are you going to be closer to the truth. Having less patients generally drastically reduces your ability to find differences between groups. Okay? So, in the interest of time, let's carry on. So, let's get back to the question. How was this study designed? This study was designed with 50 patients. Okay? That is not a lot of patients. You divided them into 27 and 23. You know, we have all done our MD thesis and we've all done studies like this. When you do studies like this, your chance of finding a real result, if there exists a difference, is in the range of 10-15%, which means that if there is a difference between arm A and arm B, you're only going to get it 10-15% of the time, because your study is underpowered and your type 2 error rate is very, very high. Okay? So in a study like this, we cannot conclude that there is no benefit of using the new drug. What did I say? We cannot reject the null hypothesis. We can only say that from our study results, we cannot conclude that there is a benefit. The results of the study, new drug and usual, is the same? No, we don't know. That is, it's not the same. Is it different sufficiently? That we cannot conclude. yes, it could be a type 2 error. Okay. And chi-square test is the absolutely correct test to use. The log-rank test is used for doing survival analysis, comparing two survival curves. We are not comparing survival curves. We are comparing response rates, which are proportions. And if I'm not wrong, Shantam may have discussed this last week.
Yes, sir.
Yes. And then, so the null hypothesis is rejected. How can it be rejected? With a p-value of 0.23, we have failed to reject the null hypothesis. Okay. So the correct answer to this question is that we have failed to reject the null hypothesis, but it could be a type 2 error. The failure is not because they are the same. The failure could be because there is a type 2 error. So this is the only correct possibility. Another correct possibility is that there is no difference at all. But that is not clear from this kind of study. Okay. So now we have the third question. You are checking the response rate of 3 agents for advanced or metastatic biliary cancer. With one, the standard drug, which is capecitabine, the response rate is 24%. And you have what is known as a 95% confidence interval, which is 18% to 30%. With agent A, this is the investigational drug, it is 28%. And the 95% confidence interval is 22% to 36%. And with agent B, so this is number one, this is the standard. This is one investigational drug. This is the second investigational drug. Okay. And here you've got 35, here it is 24%, 28%, 35%. And these are the 95% confidence intervals. Now, what can you infer from these results? Okay, no p-value is given. So, Jivok, can you put the poll on?
Yes, sir, it's there. Just it is all from question 1 to question 2. You can see question 3. Sir,
Okay.
please let me know if you want the answer.
You can stop the poll. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so let me go back. Now, what is the 95% confidence interval? A 95% confidence interval is simply a range of values within which the actual population parameter possibly lies. Okay, we want to know the response rate. Okay. Now we are doing it in a sample. We don't know the response rate in the population, but in the sample, I'm getting an estimate, a point estimate of 25% or 35% or whatever it is. But I know that it is not going to be exactly that. So what could be the real value of the point estimate? So we get a range of values, which is known as the 95% confidence intervals. Okay. Now the 95% confidence interval is actually defined in a bit of a complicated way. Say that for capecitabine, one of the drugs in the study, the real response rate, if you actually tested the 200,000 patients that are there with biliary tract or whatever biliary cancer that there is, the real value is going to be 21%. Okay, or 22%. Let's take 22%. So the mu in this diagram is 22%. Right? Now I have taken one sample. Let's say that my sample is this one. And in that sample, I've got a value of 24%. That is my point estimate. But I also have a 95% confidence interval, which goes from 21 to 27. Now, what does the 95% confidence interval mean? It is defined in a way, so listen me out, is that if you take many samples of patients from, one in your hospital, one in my hospital, one in Mumbai, one in Norway, one in New York, and gave them capecitabine, then you would get a point estimate and a 95% confidence interval in every case. Each of these samples. Now, if I have 100 samples like this, then 95 of them, or if I take 20 samples, then 19 of them, the confidence interval would actually contain 22 in it. Okay? So that is what the 95% confidence interval means. That if I have many 95% confidence intervals, then 95% of them will have the true value inside it, in its range. One of them, 1 out of 20 will not. This could be some sample in Norway or New York or whatever. Okay. So this 95% confidence interval will not have the real value. So this 21 to 27%, we are more or less sure that the real value lies from 21 to 27%. We are not 100% sure. Because if we take many of these, 1 out of 20 will not have it. So I'm 95% confident that the value lies between 21 and 27. Okay? So this is what the 95% confidence interval means. Now, how are these confidence intervals obtained? Don't get scared about the formula on the screen. We are not going to discuss it, but some of this concept is important. Now, I have only one sample, right? I am not in New York. I am in Kolkata. I am in Tata Medical Center, and this is my sample. Okay. So I've got 24. How do I get this number? How do I get this number? This is my point estimate, but around my point estimate, I will add a range. Okay. How will I get this range? I will take the standard deviation and I will divide it by the square root of the number of patients I have. So if I have 52 patients, it will be square root of 52. And then I will multiply by that by Z. Z is a number, a statistical number, which in the case of 95% confidence interval is 1.96 or 2. Okay. So I will take the mean, which is 24, plus minus twice the standard deviation divided by the square root of n. This is known as the standard error. This thing. Okay. So you can, what I want you to appreciate, all of you, is that this range that is there will depend heavily on two things: the standard deviation and the number of people in the sample. And if my sample size, the standard deviation I don't have any control over, but the n I do. If instead of 52, okay, I had 5,200, what would happen? This square root of n will increase. So this value will fall. And my confidence interval will shrink. So I will not have a big range. If I took this another sample, I would probably get a confidence interval like this. So I would be much more exact in my point estimate because it can only have smaller errors. When I have less than 30 samples, I will use a slightly modified formula where instead of Z, I will use a t value. Never mind about that. Okay. So the best way to reduce the 95% confidence. So when I say that my response rate is 24% with a 95 confidence interval of 21 to 27, it can be anywhere between 21 to 27. So that's a wide range, isn't it? If I want to reduce the range, I need to do this experiment on a greater number of patients. Then I will get a much smaller 95% confidence interval. And I will be able to get a much more exact estimate of what happens in the population. Okay. Now, if I am not given the p-value, then how will I use the confidence intervals to derive the p-value or to get an idea about what the p-value is going to be? Okay. Now here, pay attention. Let's look at the second part of this page when comparing two sets of point estimates and 95% confidence intervals. Now let us say that I have an estimate of 24 and 95% confidence intervals going from 21 to 27 with capecitabine. With another drug, I have a point estimate of 25 and I have a 95% confidence interval of something like this. And I have another drug, 35. It's like this. If my confidence intervals do not overlap, my p-value will be less than 0.05. Okay? Always. If my confidence interval overlaps, but my point estimate, so this is 35, I'm comparing these two. Okay? Now the confidence intervals overlap, but my point estimate is outside this confidence interval. Then it could be less than 0.05, but I don't know. I have to do a test. But when I compare these two, my confidence intervals overlap and my point estimate is within the confidence interval of the other group, then it will always be more than 0.05. So using just the confidence intervals without using any p-value, I can say whether my test is statistically significant many times. So let us get back to this. This is 24, 18 to 30. Okay. B is 35, 31 to 39. So confidence intervals do not overlap. So B is better than capecitabine. Okay. Is A better than capecitabine? As you can see that the confidence intervals overlap and the point estimate also overlaps. So A is not, not greater than capecitabine. But I can't say much about A versus B. Okay? Because it could be different or it could be the same. I will have to compare it and see. Now let us look at the answers, and I think I made a mistake. Okay, let's look at each of these choices. B is better than A and capecitabine. I know that B is better than capecitabine, but I don't know whether B is better than A. So this is wrong. B is better than capecitabine, but not sure about A. This is correct. Okay, so B is better than capecitabine, but B is not better than A. So I reframed it in a wrong way. Both A and B are better than capecitabine is wrong, as you can see. A could be better than capecitabine. A is not better than capecitabine because of what I just mentioned. Okay, and we can't really judge until we get a p-value is also wrong, because we can. We know that B is better than capecitabine because their confidence intervals do not overlap. So many people believe that p-values are overused, that they are misleading to a great extent, and they feel that instead of reporting p-values, we should report the point estimate and the 95% confidence intervals. And using this logic, you will be able to make out which is better than what. Okay. The fourth question, I'm going to hurry up now because I think I'm taking too much time. Do we have to finish now, Jibok?
Oh, sir, please continue.
Yeah. So the fourth question is this. IMRT is being compared to 3D conformal radiotherapy for the reduction of late xerostomia in head and neck cancer. The salivary flow rate measured in ml per minute and the xerostomia score, which is a value out of 10, is compared every 6 months. Okay. So you've got two groups. Every 6 months, you get a saliva flow rate and a xerostomia score for each of the groups. And you've got these p-values for the flow rate and these p-values for the xerostomia score. Now, how should I interpret this? Okay, as you can see, we've got this value, we've got this value, okay, which is less than 0.05. So how should this be interpreted? So let's see what the poll says. Okay, Jivok, if you've got enough answers, please close the poll.
So only 4 votes.
Yeah, I'm glad that people are volunteering to answer. See, I'm sure that many of the students today are new to statistics. And it is a joy to see so many people here in the first place. I'm discussing some slightly tricky concepts, so it's perfectly okay if you're feeling shaky about it. But because it's a poll, you don't have to worry. Nobody will know.
We have enough, sir. I'm ending then.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so there's a clear winner, number 3. Okay, so let's get back to so here we have a clear case of multiple comparisons. Okay, you've got so many p-values for one question. And multiple comparisons can be extremely problematic. Okay, they are very common in research. We often divide our groups into subgroups. We don't get a p-value, significant in the main question, so we start looking at, let us look at only stage 3, 4. Let us look at only women. Let us look at only postmenopausal. In our desperation to get a significant p-value. Okay. Sometimes we will do multiple comparisons between 2+ groups with different time points, like here, 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, 2 years. Sometimes you will have multiple outcome variables. You want to check overall survival also, progression-free survival also, response rate also, all kinds of things. And sometimes you will do interim analyses. So you will do an analysis of 6 months and 1 year before going on to do your final analysis at 2 years. Now, multiple comparisons is problematic because it greatly increases the chance of false positive results. Okay. Now, understand this concept that if you have set your alpha or the type 1 error rate at 0.05, then the acceptable false positive results is 5%. That is what you started out with. If we make multiple comparisons, then the false positivity rate can be much higher. And it is estimated that if you make 20 comparisons, something like what has been done in the example question, your false positive rate may be much higher, close to 60%. So you cannot make any conclusions about your p-value less than 0.05. Because it could have just happened by chance. If you do 20 comparisons, then you have very high chance that one of these 20, if one of them is less than 0.05, it could have happened by chance. The chance of that happening is 60%. Just like that, it will come out as less than 0.05. So what are the solutions? We often do it, but what are the solutions? One is to avoid it altogether. You have one clear primary endpoint. You compare that and report it. Okay? But that is not something that we do very commonly. So what are the other solutions? The other solutions are, one is to define a stricter type 1 error threshold. Instead of saying 0.05, you say, I'm going to call something significant if it is 0.01. Okay. The other is to do what is known as a Bonferroni correction. So you multiply the p-value with the number of comparisons carried out. So if you've done 6 comparisons, you've got a p-value of 0.02, you multiply that by 6, and say that my actual p-value is 0.12. And that is not significant. You have more statistically robust ways of doing it rather than a Bonferroni correction, which is a very simple way. And there's something called controlling the false discovery rate, and there's a statistical process called the Benjamini-Hochberg procedure. For those who want to delve deeper, I have sent a reference link, and you can use that. It's not that difficult to understand. But you may really need to know what is happening to your subgroups. You may want to know that really, does chemoradiation help the more advanced patients? In that case, you have to plan your subgroup analysis a priori. Again, we come to this term, a priori, which means from before. And you have to say that in your design, that I am also going to look specifically for the benefit of chemoradiation in the stage 3, stage 4 patients only. And your study will then have to be powered. So your sample size will have to be calculated so that you have enough power to detect a difference in the subgroup. So you will need more patients in your study. Okay. So this is something that is very important. I have been guilty of, multiple comparisons. You will also be guilty of multiple comparisons, but we must be cognizant of the fact that it is not the correct thing to do. Okay. And there are ways to deal with it. And if you can do it within the restrictions of your study that you have, you should use a robust method to deal with the multiple comparison problem. So let's go back to it. And the answer should be 3, which is that the author should be cautious about reporting the p-values as significant. Okay. Penultimate question. 2 new drugs are being compared against cisplatin as concurrent treatment with radiotherapy in head and neck cancer. In study A, 1 new drug showed a median disease-free survival of 2.4 years versus 2 years with cisplatin. The p-value was 0.04. In another study, a new drug B showed a median disease-free survival of 2.6 years versus 2.3 years, and the p-value was 0.02. What can we conclude? So please answer in the poll. Yeah, so Jibok, whenever you're ready, just close it. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I'll just wait for maybe 30 seconds.
Yes, certainly.
Okay, so I'm ending the poll now.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so interesting results, very good. So let us discuss. Right. So we need to understand what p-values don't tell you. Okay. P-values do not give you the effect size. Okay. So if one p-value is less than 0.04, and another p-value is 0.02, you cannot say that this drug is better than this drug because this p-value was smaller. It has absolutely no relation. And what you also cannot do is that you cannot use the p-value of one study against the p-value of another study. Okay, so you cannot say that in study A, nivolumab was better with a p-value of 0.03, and now in study B, pembrolizumab is 0.04, so nivolumab is better. You cannot say that. Okay, so let us come to the question. What do we know? We know that the DFS increased from 2.4 years versus 2 years, 2.6 years versus 2.3 years. You can see that even in the control arm, there is a difference. There is a difference between the results. And you've got significant improvement in both studies. So what can you conclude? You cannot conclude that drug B is better than drug A because the p-value is less, because they have no relation. The p-value has no relation in terms of effect sizes. Drug B better than drug A because the DFS is more, 2.6 versus 2.4. You can't say that because even here the control population DFS is also different, no? So this is also wrong. Can you say that they are of similar effectiveness? Well, not really. You cannot compare two studies at all, in fact. And it could very well be that drug A could prove to be better than drug B if a big randomized trial was conducted of 2,000-3,000 patients. So the point that I'm trying to make is that never try to compare one study versus another study, either with p-values or with the point estimates of the main outcome. You will make misleading interpretations and will confuse yourself, because when a study is actually done which compares this drug A versus this drug B, it may turn out to be opposite of what you thought. Okay, so the correct answer in this case is 4. A very important concept is the concept of statistical significance versus clinical significance. Now, very often these days, we have studies which have 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 patients. When you have studies that are so huge, as I mentioned, when you have a huge study, you are going to get very precise estimates of their effect sizes. Okay? So your confidence intervals will be very narrow. And very often you will get significant difference. Your p-value will be less than 0.05. But that does not mean statistical significance is not the same as clinical significance. Clinical significance is what you define, what you understand as a doctor. Many new drugs which come into the market improve outcomes by a few weeks. Okay? So you may find that new fancy drug X improves outcomes over cisplatin-based, cisplatin 5-FU-based chemotherapy by 4 weeks, and the p-value is less than 0.01. Should you start using that drug? The answer is no. Your practice should be based on clinical significance. When do you think it is safe and it is cost effective to use a new agent? You may decide that I'm not going to start using any new drug in this particular situation, in metastatic esophageal cancer, for example, unless it improves my survival by 3 months or more. So you may have a study where you have a 4-week improvement which is statistically significant, but it will not be clinically significant. So if you look at this graph, this is your line of no difference. And this is the line that you set as your line of clinical significance. This is what you judge as a doctor. Now, you may have a large study where your benefit crosses the line of statistical significance and is also across the line of clinical significance, in which case it is statistically and clinically significant. You may have a second scenario where it is definitely statistically significant because the confidence interval is both, the entire span is better than no difference, okay? But it is across the line of clinical significance, so it was possibly clinical significant. But you can have a scenario where you can have statistical significance, but you are looking at it is much smaller. The effect size is much smaller than you would call clinical significance. And this is not, it is statistically significant, but not clinically significant. So your decision to use the results of a study, when you're interpreting a p-value, when you're interpreting the results of a study, you must also look at the effect size. By how many months, how many weeks, how many years did the survival improve? How much did the xerostomia reduce? Do I really need to use IMRT if the xerostomia reduces by 5%? But it is statistically significant. Maybe you don't. Okay? So this is a very, very, very important concept that you need to understand when you are interpreting studies. The second issue is about associations. Okay? Now, this is a study published in a very important journal called the Journal of Clinical Oncology. And it showed that coffee intake was related to recurrence and mortality from stage 3 colon cancer, a big intergroup alliance multi-institutional study. Okay. What did they show? They showed that colon cancer patients who were heavy coffee drinkers had a far lower risk of dying or having their cancer return than those who did not drink coffee, with significant benefits starting at 2 to 3 cups a day. Patient who drank 4 cups of caffeinated coffee or more a day had half the rate of recurrence or death than non-coffee drinkers. Wow. But this is a newspaper article in the New York Times, but these newspaper guys are different from our newspaper guys. They said, but the researchers caution that cancer patients should not start ordering extra tall coffees. The study, which is the first to report such findings, does not prove a cause and effect relationship between coffee drinking and lower risk of colon cancer recurrence. As other experts note, there may be differences between coffee drinkers and abstainers that the research was not able to account for. So you will see many studies where you will find coffee drinking, eating X or Y or vitamins or something like that, which may be associated with an outcome. You need to understand that these are associations and this is not a causation. So even though this is not a statistical slide, you need to understand that association is not causation, and you should not take any affirmative action if you get studies like this, unless you can explain why coffee drinking could result in these outcomes. So the final question, just a few minutes more. This is an immunotherapy agent called nivolumab, is being compared against temozolomide in high-grade gliomas with microsatellite instability. The hazard ratio for death is reported as 0.8 with a 95% confidence interval of 0.65 to 0.98. How can you interpret this? Okay. So you can open the poll. Okay, I'm not going to keep you for very long. This has been a very long evening. I didn't realize it was going to be so bad. Okay, I think that Jivok, you don't need to keep it on for very long.
Okay, sir, I'm closing it.
Okay, so this, I'm very happy to see that everybody is correct. Okay, so hazard ratios are a type of relative risk, or what is the risk of an event happening, that is death or progression or something like that. An important understanding is that this is defined as an instantaneous risk. How many people are dying within a short span of time versus, group A versus group B. Okay, and it is done in a short unit of time. Never mind about this. It is just good enough that you understand that it's a relative risk. So when I say a hazard ratio of death, I mean a relative risk of death in the experimental arm versus the standard arm. And if the hazard ratio is 0.8, it means that at any unit interval, the ratio of probability the person will die in the study group versus the control group is 0.8, but can be as low as 0.7 or as high as 0.9. Now, hazard ratios can be generated for categorical variables, that is, groups based on intervention, prognostic factor. Okay, so arm A versus arm B. Or for numerical variables where you are so it's death versus no death rather, or you can have so allocation to arm A versus allocation to arm B. So that's a categorical variable, or it can be a numerical variable, height in arm A versus height in arm B. Okay, but usually we see it as in the group allocations or in categories that you are there. In a randomized control trial, it will be group allocation. If you are doing it in a retrospective study, you can be stage 1, 2 versus stage 3, 4, etc., etc. So this is a univariate analysis with a hazard ratio where people, isoniazid was compared to placebo in children with tuberculosis. And the hazard ratio was 0.46 and a 95% confidence interval was 0.2 to 0.95, which meant that the risk of death was about 46% compared to the risk with placebo. But the actual value could lie anywhere between 0.22 to 0.95. Okay. This is an example of a multivariate hazard ratio model. So you can see that how to interpret hazard ratios. If the confidence intervals are on the same side of 1, then this result is statistically significant. If it spans both sides of 1, it is not statistically significant. So even though the hazard may be higher or lower, we have to look at the 95% confidence intervals to make an estimate. So we can see that this is significant, this is significant, this is significant, this is significant. Okay. I hope you get the point. I'm looking at the 95% confidence intervals to see whether it's on the same side of 1 or not. This is an example from a paper that I was an author in, looking at a large population of patients with oropharyngeal cancer from Tata Memorial Hospital in Mumbai when I was training there. And we were looking at the predictors for disease-free survival and locoregional control. So as you can see that all these factors, the hazard ratio was statistically significant because, as you can see, that the 95% confidence intervals are on the same side of 1. So tobacco users were more likely to have disease recurrence. KPS less than 80 was more likely to have disease recurrence. Heavier nodal stage, lower dose, overall treatment time more than 50 days. So from this question 6, we know that the correct answer is that the point estimate of the risk of death is 80% because it is 0.8. But the risk of death could be as low as 65% or as high as 98%. But because it is still less, not more than 100%, this will be interpreted as statistically significant. So this is the correct answer. The other answers are wrong. And most of you got this very easily. So thank you very much. The reason I've put this slide is because to emphasize the importance of statistics. You know, our syllabus, our curriculum takes time to change. But in many other parts of the world, a very fundamental requirement to become a clinical oncologist is to understand statistics. So for example, in the UK, if you have to be an oncologist, you have to pass the FRCR Part 1 exam first before you do any clinical test. And there are 4 subjects in FRCR Part 1. There's medical physics, there's pharmacology, because it's a clinical oncology course. There's radiobiology and cancer biology, and there's medical statistics. So they realize that unless you understand medical statistics, you do not become an oncologist at all. You have to pass that exam before you can take any clinical Part 2 exam. So if any of you later on in your careers are interested in doing the FRCR, you can, get in touch with us because we run some of the FRCR courses, and I'm hoping that this class was of benefit to you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rajat. I'm really sorry I took so long.
No, thank you. Indranil, actually, you the topic, you explained the topic very lucidly. Really, it's a tricky topic. Statistics is fearsome to most of the students I know. But it's very important, as you rightly pointed out. It's very important not only for the MD students, but as a whole for oncology persons, those who are dealing with oncology patients. Very important to interpret results, effects of drugs, and the new methods that are being available. We have to interpret very cautiously. Thank you, Indranil, once again. And now, Kostab, do we have something for Jivak?
Also, we are not having demonstration today, sir.
Yeah, okay. So, without wasting further time, we move on to demonstration. Questions being dealt with now or later on?
Sir, there is one just question. Sir, could you take this question?
Wait a second. I'm just struggling with the chat box here. Just one, yeah, sure.
Sir, I'm just asking a question. No problem. Sir, is it possible to test both drugs against a common control arm? If so, can we infer the difference between the 2 drugs? By Dr. Annay Dasgupta. Sir, please.
Yes, we can, but our study has to be designed like that. Okay, there are many studies where in a parallelly 2 different drugs are compared to a common control arm. Now that is a bit of an advanced statistical design. Now you can compare 3 different things in one study. Okay, you can compare, but that study design is slightly different. It requires many more patients. There are other study designs where you are going to compare, you're going to run 2 studies parallelly, one study comparing drug A versus standard, the other study comparing drug B versus standard. And after some time, you're going to choose, these are known as pick the winner designs. These are phase 2 prospective studies where you can decide which drug to use for a phase 3 randomized control trial. Okay. Now, for these, you obviously need statistical help, and I would not recommend these kind of designs in as a part of your thesis, etc. In my thesis, I'll take 1 minute more. When I went into my MD, I was told by my thesis guide that this is your thesis, and my thesis was testing 3 different regimes of endobronchial brachytherapy in palliative radiotherapy for lung cancer. And I went and told my guide that, sir, this is a 3-arm study. It is problematic. So I was told that, no, this is what you have to do. Now, I realized, and I continue to realize, that was a very, very bad study design. Because if I had to compare 3 arms versus each other, I would need some 600-700 patients. And my study had only 45 patients in it. Okay, and many of you will go through the same agony. So, but I want you to understand that you should at least have the insight to understand that when you do a 3-arm study, you need many more patients. But there are increasingly the availability of new fancy statistical methods with which you can do phase 2 studies, prospective studies, where parallelly 2 things are being compared with each other. Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sir, there is another question. How to define the clinical significance, some percentage of survival advantage or percentage of some unit event for a study and calculation of the sample size?
There is no statistical method. It is you have to, it may be your clinical significance level may be different from my clinical significance level. Say, suppose you are working in a government setup and you have one machine that can do IMRT and 5 machines that cannot do IMRT. Okay, I have just the opposite. Now, I may decide that even if IMRT has 5% benefit, I will use it because there is a benefit and I have the resources available. For you, it may be different. You may say that I don't have the capacity and my patients don't have the money. So 5% is not my clinical significance.
Very much. Yeah. Hello?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So clinical significance is for your setting. In a low middle income country like ours, we may not want to give immunotherapy for a 5% benefit in overall survival because it doesn't make sense. But in a different where everything is paid for, you may want to change your standard of care to adding immunotherapy in the adjuvant treatment of lung cancer. But here you cannot do it. Okay. So your clinical significance is what matters in your clinical setting. But as a whole, I would caution you about studies where for a few week benefit in survival, very expensive and potentially toxic drugs are being approved by the drug agencies like the FDA, because really there is a significant benefit statistically, but you should not start using those drugs because their benefit is not really clinically meaningful. Okay, so that is the main important thing that I wanted to talk to you about.
Thank you. Other questions over?
Sir, there is another question. I think Yog is asking the question. So,
interpretation of p-values is close to 0.05, but above it. Okay, that's an important question. Actually, I will answer this question. This is important because there is no such concept as trending towards significance. Okay. So that's another very commonly used term that is used. There is no concept called trending towards. It is not a movement towards a goal. Okay. You have defined your type 1 error as 0.05. Anything above it, you have failed to reject the null hypothesis. Anything under it, you have rejected it. It is, we know that it is rigid, it has its problems, but there is no such concept of trending towards significance. That is something that we mislead ourselves with and should be avoided.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll move over to our next part, demonstration on SPSS by Dr. Jiva Bhattacharya. Sorry, we are the time.
Not having any demonstration today, sir.
आज के
No
नहीं.
demonstration today.
No, sir.
Okay. Okay, you are skipping that. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think we already crossed our time limit by a lot.
Yes.
Thank you, Indranil, and thank you everybody for patient hearing.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, all of you. I can see Jyoti Roop and Abhishek and all. Thank you very much for organizing this and giving time for this. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir, for the excellent demonstration, and we are going to close our session. And one just announcement that on the next week, due to this festive week, we are keeping any class already in the schedule. So our next class is on 21st, I guess, 21st Saturday. So again, we meet there. So good night, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.